The babysitter whispered, "Sir, your daughter is bleeding. My wife took her phone away, so she couldn't call me. My 5-year-old kept screaming, 'Daddy, please come home.' I canceled my flight and returned early. 2 hours later, someone was arrested. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Nolan Grady never missed bedtime. Not once. Not in 3 years of 8 p.m. calls. Not during winter storms that shut down highways. Not during the 6-day stretch last summer when he worked a commercial roofing job in Kansas and barely slept. He always found a quiet corner, always dialed, always waited for that small voice to come through the speaker. It started when Ivy was 3 years old, during a stretch of bad thunderstorms that rolled through Ash Creek week after week. She was terrified of thunder. Not just startled by it, terrified. She would press her face into the couch cushions and refuse to move. Nolan had been 4 hours away on a job that week, working in the rain himself, and the helplessness of not being there burned him. So he called her every night at 8 p.m. He talked to her until the fear left her voice. He told her the thunder was just clouds arguing with each other. He told her the lightning was someone taking pictures of her bedroom because it was the most beautiful room in the whole world. The explanations were nonsense, and he knew it, and she probably knew it too. But she stopped crying. The storms eventually stopped. The calls never did. Now Ivy was 6 and brave about thunderstorms, and she still expected his call every single night at 8 p.m. Sometimes she had things to report, a drawing she finished, something funny her teacher said, a caterpillar she found near the back fence. Sometimes she just said goodnight and hung up. It did not matter either way. The call happened. That Thursday evening, Nolan sat inside a budget hotel room on the outskirts of Phoenix. The carpet smelled like industrial cleaner. The air conditioning rattled against the window frame. His roofing boots sat near the door, still carrying the pale dust of the Arizona job sites he had walked that week. He had attended a regional roofing contractors convention. 2 days of vendor panels, supplier deals, and handshakes that could mean real money for his business if he followed through correctly. He was tired in the way only 3 consecutive days of standing on your feet in desert heat can make a man tired. He picked up his phone at 7:58 p.m. and dialed Ivy's number. It rang 4 times. No answer. That was already unusual. Ivy usually answered before the 3rd ring. She kept the tablet on the nightstand specifically so she could grab it fast when his call came in. He dialed again. This time it went straight to voicemail. Not even a full ring. Nolan stood up from the edge of the bed. He walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot without really seeing it. The unease was immediate and physical, like cold water poured down the back of his neck. He called his wife's number next. Straight to voicemail. He sat back down slowly. He looked at the time. 8:03 p.m. He tried Ivy's tablet number again. Voicemail again. Then his phone buzzed in his hand from an unknown Missouri number. He answered immediately. A young woman spoke very fast and very quietly, like someone hiding behind a door. "Mr. Grady, please don't hang up. My name is Lena. I'm watching Ivy tonight." Nolan did not recognize the name. Camille usually handled babysitter arrangements when he traveled. He had assumed it was someone familiar. He said nothing and let her keep talking. "Something is wrong here, and I did not know who else to call. I found your number in the emergency contacts on the fridge." Her voice was shaking. "I think Ivy needs to go to the hospital." Nolan was already on his feet, moving toward his bag. "Tell me what happened." Her arm is hurt in her face, and she keeps asking for you. Then Ivy's voice came through the background of the call, sharp and desperate the way a child's voice gets when they have completely run out of options. "Daddy, please come home." Nolan's whole chest locked up. Then a crash. Something falling hard against the floor. Then Camille's voice, tight and furious in that way he recognized, that quiet rage she had when she did not want the neighbors to hear. "Give me that phone right now." The call cut dead. Nolan stood in the middle of the hotel room with the dead phone in his hand and the silence ringing around him. He did not yell. He did not throw anything. He opened the airline app on his phone and started searching for the first available flight back to Missouri, his hand steady and his face completely still. He found one leaving in 47 minutes. He booked it without blinking at the price. He grabbed his bag, left his convention materials spread across the desk, and walked out of that hotel room without looking back. He did not check the bathroom for his shaving kit. He did not fold his second shirt. He left the room key on the dresser and pulled the door shut and moved. The drive to the airport took 11 minutes. The rideshare driver tried to make conversation twice and stopped after the second attempt, reading the energy in the back seat correctly. Nolan stared out the window at the Phoenix Expressway at night. The orange glow of it, the wide lanes, the mountains visible as dark shapes against the sky. And he tried Ivy's number twice more on the way. Both times, voicemail. He checked in at the counter at a controlled run, the kind of movement that is just fast enough to cover ground without causing the people around you to pay attention. He made the gate with 4 minutes to spare. The gate agent scanned his phone and said something about the seat assignment, and he nodded without processing what she said and went down the jetway. He collapsed into a middle seat near the back of the plane, still wearing work clothes that smelled like sweat and Arizona dust. The man in the window seat looked at him once and then looked away and opened a magazine. The flight was 2 hours and 20 minutes. He did not sleep. He did not watch the seatback screen. He did not read the safety card or order anything from the card or do any of the small distracting things that people do during flights. He sat with his forearms on his knees and his eyes mostly open and his mind entirely somewhere else. He replayed the call. Not the crash. Not Camille grabbing the phone. Not even the babysitter's terrified whisper. Just Ivy's voice. He had heard his daughter cry many times. The ordinary crying of a small child. Frustration, tiredness, the brief sharp grief of a scraped knee or a dropped ice cream cone. He knew exactly how that sounded. He knew the specific pitch of it and the way it resolved, usually within a few minutes, into hiccups and then into calm. That was not what he had heard. She had not been crying. She had been begging. There was a difference between those two sounds that he could feel in his chest even now, sitting in seat 28C over the darkness of New Mexico or Kansas or wherever they were. Crying was fear. Begging was desperation. Begging was what came after fear had already done its work and a child had exhausted every other option, had waited, had tried the normal things, had done what they were told, and had finally understood that waiting and following the rules was not going to make things better. His daughter had been begging for him through the phone at 8:03 p.m., and someone had taken the phone away. He pressed the heel of his palm against his sternum and breathed slowly and stared at the seat back in front of him for 2 hours and 20 minutes. He would think about that voice for the rest of his life. Ash Creek, Missouri was not small enough to be quaint and not large enough to be anonymous. It sat in that middle ground where everybody knew your truck by the sound of the engine, with a diner on Oak Street could tell you who was having marital trouble before the couple knew it themselves. It was the kind of town that watched everything and said nothing until it had an opinion worth sharing, which was always. Nolan's house sat on the quieter end of Maple Ridge Road. It was not a large house. He had built the back deck himself, repaired the roof twice, replaced every window in the place the second winter after they moved in. He knew every creak in the floorboards. He knew which kitchen cabinet stuck if you pulled it too fast. He knew where Ivy hid when she wanted to avoid bath time, and he knew where the sunlight hit the backyard in the mornings in a way that made everything look better than it was. He pulled up in a rideshare at nearly 3 a.m. The porch light was on. The front windows were dark. The garage door sat half open, which bothered him immediately because he always locked everything when he traveled. He paid the driver and stood in the driveway for a moment. The street was completely quiet. The neighbor's dog, a beagle named something he could never remember, made a single low sound from the yard next door and then went quiet. Nolan walked to the front door and let himself in. The house was dim and warm and smelled wrong. Wine specifically. That sweet, cheap kind Camille bought in the large bottles when she thought he was not paying attention. And cigarette smoke underneath that, faint but real, layered into the couch fabric. Nobody smoked in this house. They never had. Ivy had asthma mild enough to manage, but serious enough that they had always kept the house clean. He had assumed Camille respected that rule. He stepped into the living room. There was a man sitting on the couch. He was wearing Nolan's sweatshirt, a gray Missouri State hoodie that Nolan had owned for 11 years, faded soft from hundreds of washes, with a small dried paint stain near the left cuff from a weekend he spent repainting the trim on the back of the house. The man was wearing it loose and comfortable, like it had been his for a while. Nolan knew who he was. Trevor Baines, 39 years old, owned a gym on the commercial strip near the edge of town. Divorced twice from two different women, both of whom had quiet things to say about him that most people in Ash Creek politely did not repeat. He was good-looking in a generic, maintained way, and he knew it. He smiled too quickly, with too many teeth, in the manner of someone who had learned early that smiling was effective and never bothered to make it sincere. He gave compliments that managed to land as condescension if you were paying attention. He shook hands too long. Nolan had met him twice before, both times at community events, both times exchanged nothing more than pleasantries. He had carried no strong opinion of him. He had one now. Trevor stood up when he saw Nolan. He came off the couch in one smooth motion, the kind that had "I'm being reasonable" built into it from the first second. "Easy, man." Nolan did not look at him. His eyes went straight to the hallway, and there was Ivy. She sat on the floor just outside the hallway entrance, wrapped in her small purple blanket with the star pattern on it. Her knees were pulled to her chest. Her face was turned toward him the moment he walked in, like she had been watching that door for hours. She had a swollen lower lip. In the dim light, it looked dark and tender. And on her right arm, just visible below the sleeve of her pajamas, there were marks, the kind of bruising that came from fingers pressing hard into soft skin. Nolan crossed the room in 4 steps and dropped to his knees in front of her. Ivy's face collapsed immediately. She had been holding herself together through pure will, and the moment she saw him, that will dissolve completely. She started sobbing. Nolan pulled her in and held her carefully, keeping his hands away from her arm. She was shaking, not the shaking of cold, but the deep, rhythmic trembling of someone who has been frightened and alone for a long time and is only now allowing themselves to fall apart. "I'm here," he said quietly. "I've got you. I'm right here. Daddy." She could barely get words out. "Mommy's friend got mad because I called you." Nolan felt something happen inside him in that moment. Not an explosion. Something quieter than that. Something that set, the way concrete sets, permanent and cold and impossible to undo. He straightened up slowly. He looked at the arm again, then at her lip. Then he heard Camille's voice from the kitchen doorway. "Don't start acting crazy." She was wearing his old college t-shirt, her arms already crossed, her voice already in that particular register she used when she had decided she was going to win a conversation before it started. It was an accident. She was running around, and she fell. Nolan stood up from his crouch. He looked at Camille for a long moment without speaking. He looked at her face. He looked at the way she was standing, already defensive, already building the story. Then he looked at Trevor, who had sat back down on the couch with slightly less confidence than before, one hand touching his own jaw like he was calculating something. Then Nolan looked back at Ivy's arm. "What accident leaves marks shaped like fingers on a child?" he said quietly. Camille exhaled sharply. "She's dramatic. She's just like you. She exaggerates everything." Those words landed in the room and sat there. Not the cheating, because Nolan understood, standing there in that living room, that there had been cheating, that Trevor Baines had been in this house many times before this night, wearing other people's things, existing in spaces that did not belong to him. That understanding arrived fully formed, the way some terrible truths do, not gradually but all at once, complete and final. Not the bruises, though those were already burning through him in a way that would not stop for a long time. That sentence, "She's dramatic, just like you." A mother looking at her own bruised child, and her first instinct was to defend the man who put those bruises there. Her first instinct was to discredit her daughter. That sentence ended the marriage. Trevor stood up from the couch again. He had made a decision somewhere in the last 30 seconds that the situation required managing. He straightened up, put his hands out a little, and adopted the voice that men use when they think they can talk their way out of something physical. "Look, man, let's just everybody calm down." The kid was acting up and things got a little out of hand, but it's not. He never finished the sentence. Nolan hit him. It was not a warning shot. It was not a shove or a push or a grab. It was a straight right hand that caught Trevor across the bridge of his nose with everything Nolan had, which was considerable. Years of roofing work had built Nolan's upper body into something functional and serious. Not the gym-built kind of strength that looked impressive in a mirror. The real kind that came from lifting heavy things for 12 hours at a stretch, from carrying bundles of shingles up extension ladders, from driving roofing nails by hand on the days the nail gun jammed. The crack of Trevor's nose was loud. Blood went sideways across the hardwood floor in a spray. Camille screamed. Trevor stumbled hard into the coffee table, sending a wine glass and a small candle clattering to the floor. He tried to grab the edge of the couch to steady himself and missed. Nolan grabbed him by the front of his own sweatshirt, his own, the one with the paint stain, and slammed him backward into the wall hard enough that the framed photo of Ash Creek Lake rattled sideways on its hook. Trevor swung back. It was instinct, not strategy, and it was a bad mistake. Nolan was not angry in the way that made men careless. He was angry in the way that made men precise. He blocked the swing, stepped inside it, and hit Trevor twice more, once in the ribs and once across the jaw, and Trevor went down the second time without the dignity of grabbing anything on the way. The fight, if you could call it that, lasted less than 90 seconds. Neighbors 2 houses down later said the sounds coming from inside the Grady house were unlike anything they had heard before. Not just hitting, they said, but something underneath it, a sustained and terrible focus that was somehow worse than pure rage. When the police arrived, responding to a 911 call from the neighbor on the left, Trevor was barely moving on the hardwood floor. His nose was broken, 2 ribs cracked, his lips split in 2 places. Nolan stood near the hallway with Ivy pressed against his side, one hand on her back, his breathing already returning to normal. The officers looked at the room, at Trevor on the floor, at the child with the bruised arm and the swollen lip, at Nolan standing there calm as stone. One of the officers, a young guy Nolan recognized from the hardware store, looked at Ivy's arm and then back at the room and said nothing for a moment. Then he took a slow breath and started asking questions in a quiet, careful voice. Nolan answered everything directly. Camille started talking over him. The officer focused on Ivy. At the hospital, Ivy refused to let go of Nolan's hand. Not on the walk-in, not during the exam, not while the nurse in the pale green scrubs worked carefully around her arm, documenting what she found. Not once during any of it. She kept her right hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers and held on with the grip of someone twice her size. The hospital was quiet at that hour. The hallways had that after-midnight stillness, the kind where every sound carried further than it should. The distant squeak of a supply cart, the muffled PA overhead, the hum of the vending machine at the end of the corridor. Nolan sat beside the examination table with his back straight and his hand exactly where Ivy needed it to be. A child therapist arrived around 4:30 a.m. Her name was Dr. Paulette Reeves, mid-40s, calm in the professional way of someone who had sat with frightened children many times before and understood that the worst thing you could do in those rooms was rush. She sat in a small chair near the bed and let Ivy look at her for a full 2 minutes before saying a single word. Then she asked, very simply, if Ivy wanted to tell her about tonight. Ivy looked at Nolan. He squeezed her fingers gently. You could talk to her. I'm right here. And then Ivy talked. She talked for almost 40 minutes, stopping sometimes to collect herself, starting again with the particular determination of a child who has decided that telling the truth is more important than being comfortable. The therapist wrote everything down without interrupting. Nolan listened without moving. What he learned in those 40 minutes remade his understanding of the past year. Trevor Baines had not appeared in their lives recently. He had been a presence in that house for nearly 8 months. Every time Nolan traveled to job sites in other cities, to supplier meetings in St. Louis, to the convention in Phoenix, Trevor came to the house. Not just visited, stayed, slept over, sat at the kitchen table in the mornings, used the bathroom that Nolan had retiled with his own hands on a long weekend 2 summers ago, made himself coffee in the kitchen using the same machine Nolan had bought the year Ivy was born. Camille had told Ivy that Trevor was a friend, that he was just helping out, that it was important not to tell Daddy because Daddy would not understand. She had framed it to a 6-year-old as a simple matter of adult privacy. Ivy, who was 6 and trusted her mother, had kept quiet for months. She was a child who understood at a basic level that the adults around her had rules she was not always allowed to know, and she had followed those rules because that was what you did. But Ivy also hated Trevor. She said this plainly, with the directness of a child who did not yet understand the social reasons to soften that kind of statement. He was mean. He got annoyed when she made noise. He told her to go to her room in a way that was different from how her parents said it. Harder, with something underneath it that she did not have words for, but clearly remembered. He had taken her tablet away twice, and once disconnected the charger from her room because she kept using it late at night to look up videos, which she did when she could not sleep, more and more often as the months went on. He called her that kid when talking to Camille. Not in a joke way. The night everything broke, Ivy had used Camille's phone, not her tablet, because Trevor had taken it into the other room to call Lena, the babysitter who was supposed to be watching her while Camille and Trevor were in the back of the house. Ivy told Lena she wanted her dad. She was scared and she was tired, and she wanted her dad to come home. Lena found Nolan's number on the emergency contacts on the refrigerator door and dialed it. Trevor heard Ivy talking. He came out of the back room, fast, the way he moved when he was angry, which was different from how he moved the rest of the time. He grabbed her arm, not gently, not even like someone being impatient, hard, with the full strength of an adult who was not thinking about who he was grabbing. He pulled her away from the phone. She screamed. He slapped her, once open-handed across the face, hard enough to split her lip and hard enough that she fell backward against the counter edge. Camille came into the room. Camille saw all of it, and Camille looked at her 6-year-old daughter on the floor and said, "If you would have just stayed quiet, none of this would have happened." Then she took the phone from Lena. Then she saw that Lena had already dialed Nolan, and her voice, when she grabbed that phone, was not concern. It was control. Get that phone. Get the story straight. Manage it. Nolan sat completely still through all of it. The therapist later wrote in her official report that the father displayed controlled anger consistent with shock. She noted that he did not interrupt, did not attempt to redirect the child's account, and did not show any behavioral signs of disbelief. She noted that Ivy maintained eye contact with her father throughout, and that this appeared to provide her with stability. What the report could not capture was the thing that was happening inside Nolan Grady while he sat in that chair at 4:30 a.m. in a hospital examination room with his daughter's fingers around his. He was not planning revenge. He was not cataloging grievances. He was doing something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. He was making a decision, not a sudden one, but the kind that arrives so completely that you understand it has been building for a long time, about what his life was going to look like from this point forward, about what Ivy's life was going to look like, about what Camille was never going to be again. By the time they left the hospital, as the first pale light was coming up over the tree line east of town, Nolan had not said much. The nurse gave Ivy a stuffed bear. The doctor gave Nolan paperwork. The therapist gave him her card and said she would be in touch. Nolan put Ivy in the back seat of the borrowed car, made sure her seatbelt was right, and stood in the hospital parking lot for 60 seconds alone before getting in the driver's seat. The sky was going from gray to gold at the edges. He drove home. The house was theirs again, in the way a house becomes yours when you're the only one left in it with a reason to stay. He made up Ivy's bed with clean sheets, and he checked the locks on all the windows, and he sat in the kitchen until the light outside went from black to gray to the thin gold of very early morning. Then he went upstairs and lay down on top of the covers and closed his eyes and thought about what came next. Camille came back at 9 the next morning. She had spent the night at Trevor's apartment, or perhaps at a friend's house. Nolan neither knew nor cared, and she returned with the particular energy of someone who had spent hours constructing a version of events that absolved them of everything. She had the composed face on, the reasonable voice, the slight tilt of the head that said she was prepared to be patient with him. She turned her key in the front door and found it would not open. She tried again. Same result. She knocked. The door opened. Nolan stood in the doorway. He was dressed. He had slept 2 hours, maybe 3 after getting Ivy down, and he looked exactly like a man who had slept 2 hours, worn around the edges, eyes clear and cold. He was holding a folder of papers. Behind him, through the open doorway, Camille could see the living room. It looked different, tidier, in fact, than it had been in months. The wine glass was gone from the floor. The coffee table had been righted. Everything Camille owned, her clothes, her shoes, her makeup bags and designer handbags and jewelry boxes, and the collection of scented candles she kept on the bedroom windowsill, was no longer inside the house. It was in the driveway. Every bit of it, stacked and sorted, actually, which somehow made it worse. He had not thrown things out in anger. He had carried it all outside with purpose, which was a different thing entirely. The bag sat in two large piles near the garage. The rain that had started an hour earlier was working through the fabric of her things steadily. Camille looked at the driveway, then back at Nolan. "You cannot do this," she said. Her voice was still controlled, still aiming for reasonable. "This is my house, too." It was... Nolan held out the folder. "Those are divorce papers. There's a number on the front page for the attorney I've retained. She's expecting your attorney's call." Camille did not take the folder. "You're acting like I did something. She is a child." "Nolan, children exaggerate." "Camille." She stopped. "You watched him hit her," he said. "You watched it happen, and then you told her it was her fault." "That is not what—" "I was in the hospital at 4:30 in the morning listening to our 6-year-old describe 8 months of things she was told to lie to me about." "Don't." He held the folder out again. "Take the papers." She stared at him for a long moment. Then her face changed. The reasonable expression left, and something rawer came through. Not remorse, exactly, but something closer to genuine panic, the kind that arrives when a person realizes for the first time that the situation is not recoverable. She slapped him, hard, across the right side of his face. The crack of it was loud in the doorway. Nolan did not move. He did not flinch. He stood exactly where he was and let the sting of it sit in his cheek, and he stared at her with an expression so flat and absolute that Camille actually took a half step back. Then he turned his head slightly toward the hallway behind him, where Ivy stood in her pajamas, watching from 10 feet away. "Look carefully," he said quietly, still looking at Camille. "That is the last time you ever touch me." He stepped back. He closed the door. He locked it. The sound of Camille's voice through the door lasted another 20 minutes. She cycled through anger and negotiation and something that might have been genuine distress, and then back to anger. He heard her kick the door once, softly, the way a person does when they have run out of everything else. He did not open it. Ivy sat on the couch watching him through all of it. She was very still. She had the expression of a child who was reading the situation carefully and taking her cues from him, which meant she stayed calm because he stayed calm. He kept his face neutral. He kept his movements easy and unhurried. When a voice finally stopped and the sound of Camille's car started up and pulled out of the driveway, the house went quiet. After a while, Ivy asked if they could have pancakes. He said yes. He went into the kitchen and found the pancake mix in the cabinet above the stove, where it always was, and he made them while Ivy sat at the counter watching, and she ate 3 with too much syrup the way she always did, and that was that. The first morning of whatever came next. Within 3 days, the story had changed. Not for Nolan, and not for anyone who had been in that hospital room. But Camille was smart in the particular way that people who have always relied on perception management are smart. She understood that the story told first, told loudly, and told with sufficient emotion had a way of surviving even in the face of contrary evidence. She told people Nolan was abusive, not in a specific, verifiable way. She was careful enough to avoid things that could be directly disproven, but in the broad, ambient way that the word got planted. She told her friends he had been controlling for years. She told her mother he had always had a temper. She posted photographs of herself looking pale and exhausted with captions about surviving and healing and the courage it took to leave. The comment section of each post filled up with support from people who had only ever heard one side. Trevor backed her publicly. He had his own reasons for that. His nose was bandaged and 2 ribs were taped, and he had given a statement to police that positioned Nolan as a violent aggressor who attacked him without cause. He left out the part about wearing the man's sweatshirt. He left out the part about the bruises on the child. For about a week, it looked like the narrative might stick. Then Ivy ruined everything for both of them. not on purpose. Ivy was not calculating. She was simply honest, in the way children are when they have no particular reason to protect the adults around them. During a supervised interview with a county child advocate, she described the inside of her own house with a level of detail that no Coach story could have produced. She named which drawer Trevor kept his things in. She described the exact arrangement of items on the bathroom counter that Camille had apparently never bothered to move when Nolan came home. She explained, very calmly, how her mother had taken the tablet charger out of her room and put it in the master bedroom so that she could not charge it at night, making it harder for her to make contact when she was not supposed to. She explained how her mother told her that calling Daddy too much made him sad. The advocate wrote 12 pages of notes. Meanwhile, Camille filed her divorce claim. It was aggressive in a way that only happens when someone is scared and overplaying a weak hand. She asked for the house. She asked for primary custody of Ivy. She asked for half of Nolan's business, a roofing company he had built from a single truck and a used ladder set over 9 years of 6-day work weeks. She asked for monthly financial support and a portion of his savings. Nolan's attorney, a woman named Karen Yost who had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had seen this particular play performed many times, laid the divorce claim out on her desk and looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Good." Nolan raised an eyebrow. "When people overreach, it's easier to show the court who they really are," she said. "She is essentially asking a judge to reward her for what happened in that house. Let her make that argument." At the first hearing, Camille's attorney made the case. Then Karen Yost asked to present the hospital photographs. The courtroom went very quiet. The images were clinical and clear. Ivy's arm, the bruising pattern consistent, per the physician's documentation, with an adult grip applied with significant force. The lip, the notation in the nurse's report about the child's emotional state upon arrival. The therapist's notes. The physician's conclusion. Camille, sitting 3 feet to Nolan's left, looked like she had swallowed something cold. But Nolan was not finished. It was the babysitter who changed everything. Lena Ortiz was 22 years old and worked part-time at the front desk of a physical therapy clinic. She had babysat for Camille twice before this night, both times uneventful, both times Trevor was not present. She had no reason to expect this third time would be any different. She arrived at 6 p.m. with the understanding that the parents were going out and she would put Ivy to bed by 8. Trevor was already there when she arrived. Something about the house felt wrong from the first minute, though she could not have named it precisely. Trevor did not introduce himself. He barely looked at her. He went into the back of the house with Camille and the door closed. Ivy sat at the kitchen table, drawing without speaking, which was unusual for a child who was normally talkative with her. Lena had started recording on her phone about an hour into the evening. She could not fully explain why, even later. She said it was just the feeling of the house. The way Ivy kept checking the back hallway. The muffled voices from behind a closed door that had an edge to them she did not like. She propped her phone against the fruit bowl on the counter with the screen facing down and let it run. She had forgotten about it in the chaos of the hours that followed. The phone call, the police, the hospital. The recording sat in her phone unseen for 9 days before she remembered it existed. When she finally listened to it, her hands were shaking before the playback hit the 15-minute mark. She called Karen Yost directly. The audio lasted 1 hour and 42 minutes. Most of it was background noise, the television in the other room, Ivy's quiet humming while she drew, the distant sound of kettle. But 6 minutes of it was not background noise at all. It captured Camille screaming at Ivy in the kitchen. Not heated parenting, screaming. The kind of volume that said something had broken through whatever restraint she normally maintained. Then Trevor's voice, lower and more frightening, telling Ivy in specific terms what would happen if she kept making noise. Then the sound of Ivy's arm hitting the counter edge as she was grabbed, that hollow, painful crack of a small body being moved without care. Then the slap. And then, most devastating of all, Camille's voice in the immediate aftermath, already explaining away what had just happened before the child had even stopped crying. If you would have just stayed quiet, none of this would have happened. The judge, when the recording was played in chambers 2 weeks later, asked for it to be stopped twice. not because she wanted it removed from evidence, because she needed a moment. She later called that sentence, "If you would have just stayed quiet," deeply disturbing in the context of a mother responding to her child's injury. Trevor Baines was arrested on felony child abuse charges 2 days after the recording was submitted to the prosecutor's office. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning outside his gym, in front of 3 people who work for him. Camille lost temporary custody of Ivy that same afternoon. Nolan got the call from Karen Yost while he was on a job site replacing damage flashing on a commercial building outside of town. He was 40 feet up when his phone buzzed. He read the message, put the phone back in his pocket, and finished the section he was working on before he allowed himself to think about it. Then he sat on the roof ridge for a few minutes with the afternoon light coming across the fields, and he looked out at nothing in particular and let the news settle. It was not celebration, exactly. It was something quieter, the satisfaction of watching something inevitable finally arrive. Ash Creek, which had been carefully neutral for 2 weeks while both stories circulated, made its decision overnight. The diner on Oak Street, the hardware store, the parents at Ivy's school who had been watching the situation and saying little. One by one, they came to the same conclusion, and they stopped being neutral, and Camille found out what it felt like to walk into a room that had already made up its mind about her. She had spent years building a version of herself in that town. The capable woman, the dedicated mother, the steadying presence. She had invested real effort in it, and she discovered, in the days after the recording became public knowledge, that the version of yourself that you build on top of lies does not survive the lies coming out. It does not crack gradually. It collapses all at once. Camille's parents drove in from Springfield the following weekend. Her father, a retired postal worker named Gerald, sat in the parking lot of the county courthouse for 40 minutes before coming inside. Her mother, Diane, went directly to Nolan at the entrance and told him, very quietly and with great feeling, that he had destroyed a family. He looked at her calmly. "No," he said. "I found out what was happening to my daughter, and I stopped it." Diane's eyes filled, but she did not soften. "You humiliated her. You threw things in the rain like garbage." "I gave her a week to take them inside herself," he said. She chose not to. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He just said what was true and let it sit there, and then he went back to talking to his attorney. Camille's sister, Beth, sent him a long message 2 days later about perspective and forgiveness and the importance of considering what Camille had been going through. He read it once, noted that it contained no mention of Ivy's injuries, and did not respond. Some people in town took the position that perhaps the whole thing could have been resolved more quietly. They did not say this directly to Nolan. They said it to each other in the particular way that communities process things they find uncomfortable. Maybe you should have talked to Camille first. Maybe involving lawyers and courts and county child advocates was an overreaction. Maybe a man like Nolan, steady and competent as he was, could have handled things privately. A conversation, a warning, something that stayed inside the family and did not end up on the local news segment that ran on the Tuesday after the arrest. That nearly broke him, not because it shook his certainty. He had no uncertainty about what he had done, not a single moment of doubt. He had walked into his house at 3 a.m. and found his daughter bruised on the floor, and he had done exactly what any father in his right mind should have done. And then he had done the slower, harder work of making it stick legally, so that it could not be undone. It broke him because of what it revealed. How many people, faced with a child who had been hurt inside her own home, defaulted first to the question of how to keep it private? How many people believed that protecting the family's appearance was more important than protecting the child inside it? How many people had a knee-jerk instinct to give the mother the benefit of the doubt that they would never have given the father in the same situation? He thought about Camille on those online posts, those photographs in soft light with the captions about healing, and the hundreds of comments from people who had never been in that hospital room and never would be. He understood something in those days that he wished he did not understand. The world had a long and practiced tradition of looking out for bad mothers, simply because they were mothers. The fact of motherhood was armor in ways that nothing else was. It did not matter what the evidence showed. Some people would always hold a space for reasonable doubt when a mother was involved because to give that up felt like giving up something fundamental. It was easier to believe that a child exaggerated than to believe that a mother failed. He had watched Camille bank on that assumption from the very beginning. One evening, Ivy asleep inside, the street dark and quiet, the last of the summer warmth finally going out of the Missouri air. Nolan sat on the back deck he had built himself, and his older brother Rhett came out and handed him a beer and sat down beside him. They sat there for a while without talking. Rhett was 4 years older than Nolan and had always been the one who said less than he meant. He knew when to sit and when to speak, and he had learned a long time ago that his younger brother needed quiet more than he needed conversation when things were bad. He looked at Nolan for a moment and then looked out at the dark yard and the tree line beyond the back fence. "You still love her?" he asked. Nolan thought about the question, not performing the thinking, actually doing it, actually checking. He had done this before, in quiet moments over the past weeks, and the answer had been the same each time. "No," he said. It came out clean and certain. "I don't think I have for a long time." "Then what is it?" Rhett asked. "Because you've got that look." Nolan took a slow drink and set the bottle on the railing. "I want her to watch me win," he said quietly. Rhett nodded once, slowly, like he understood exactly what that meant and respected it completely. They sat there until the cold came up, and Nolan went inside to check on Ivy. The thing about building your life on other people's tolerance for you is that when that tolerance runs out, everything runs out at once. Camille discovered this in stages over the following months, each stage worse than the last, each one arriving before she had finished processing the one before it. Trevor turned on her almost immediately after his arrest. He had calculated, in the way that self-serving people calculate, that distancing himself from Camille was his best move, that the story of a man manipulated by an unhappy wife played better than the alternative. He told his lawyer she had encouraged the relationship. He suggested, in conversations that got back to people, that she had been the one to initiate everything, that he had just been in the wrong place at a bad time. He was protecting himself with the same instinct that had always governed him, which was the instinct of someone who had never been genuinely accountable for anything in his life. Camille had not expected that. She had expected him to stand beside her. She had expected their shared story to remain shared. She discovered instead that there are some people who will only share your story as long as sharing it benefits them. She lost her job at the dental office in October. The practice manager called it a staffing decision, and technically it was her hours had been reduced, then reduced again, and then one morning she simply was not on the schedule anymore. The real reason was simpler. The parents who brought their children to that practice had seen the local news coverage and made their preferences known quietly to the front desk. One parent is easy to ignore. 8 parents across 3 weeks is a business decision. She moved into a small apartment on the south side of town that cost more than it was worth because she had been too proud to look further away. Her legal bills mounted in a way she had not anticipated. Her attorney had told her the case was manageable, and it was, but manageable was not the same as cheap. Her savings went faster than she had planned. The financial picture that had looked sustainable in September looked genuinely precarious by November. And Trevor, having served his purpose as a lever with which to pressure Nolan and failing at that entirely, took up with another woman before the end of the year. Camille found out from a mutual acquaintance who told her, in the particular way, that people share bad news when they're also finding it faintly satisfying. Matter of fact, a little too quick. She sat in her apartment that night, surrounded by boxes she had never fully unpacked and understood, perhaps for the first time without any protective layer of justification between herself and the understanding, what she had done. Not what had been done to her. What she had done. She had built a second life inside the first one. She had brought another man into her daughter's house and told the daughter to pretend he was not there and to stay quiet and not to call her father. She had enforced that arrangement with the authority of a mother over a 6-year-old, which was the most complete authority available. She had used her daughter's trust as a mechanism. And when it broke, when Ivy, exhausted and scared and simply wanting her father, had tried to reach out, Camille's first instinct had not been to protect her. It had been to contain the situation. She had burned her own life down, and she had used her daughter as kindling. That knowledge did not make her into a better person immediately. It might not have made her into a better person at all. That part of the story was too early to tell. But it stripped away the last of the story she had been telling herself, the one where she was the misunderstood woman and Nolan was the obstacle and Trevor was the future. That story simply stopped working, like an engine that had finally run out of something essential. She was left with what remained, which was not much. The final custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in early spring. The courthouse in Ash Creek was not an impressive building. It was county-level justice in a county that had never been particularly wealthy. Linoleum floors, fluorescent lights, wooden benches worn smooth from years of use. The kind of courtroom that processed small human disasters with procedural efficiency and no ceremony. Camille arrived 10 minutes before the session was called. She looked different from the woman who had stood in that doorway 5 months earlier. The composure she had always maintained as a kind of armor was gone or damaged. She sat at her table with her coat still on, which her attorney had to quietly ask her to remove. She had lost weight in a way that people do when they're not eating properly and sleeping worse, and it showed in her face more than anywhere else. Nolan arrived with Ivy's backpack on his shoulder. He had dropped Ivy at his mother's house for the morning. He carried the backpack not out of forgetfulness, but because it was something to do with his hands and because he had gotten into the habit of carrying it and did not feel like breaking that habit today, of all days. He sat at his table with Karen Yost, and he watched Camille from across the room with no particular expression. Not coldness, not anger, not satisfaction, simply the look of a man who had made his decisions and was waiting for the formality to catch up to them. Judge Patricia Holloway had presided over the Grady case since the temporary custody order. She was 61 years old, had raised 3 children of her own, and had been hearing family court cases for 19 years. She was not sentimental, and she was not easily impressed. She reviewed the recordings. She reviewed the medical reports from the hospital, the admitting physician's notes, the photographs, the documentation of Ivy's injuries, the timeline constructed from physical evidence. She reviewed the testimony of Dr. Paulette Reeves, the child therapist, who stated on record that Ivy showed clear signs of a prolonged anxiety pattern consistent with a child who had been managing fear inside the home environment for an extended period, and that she showed marked improvement in the months since being placed in her father's primary care. She reviewed the witness statements, Lena's account, the responding officer's report, the neighbor's statement about the sounds from the house that night. She reviewed the subsequent history, Trevor's criminal charges, the ongoing probation proceedings, Camille's 2 documented interactions with Trevor at his apartment that had required police response. When all of this had been entered and reviewed, Camille's attorney stood and made his closing argument. It was technically competent. He emphasized Camille's history as a primary caregiver. He noted her completion of a required parenting course. He pointed to a letter from her therapist. She had begun seeing a therapist, which was noted as positive, attesting to her engagement and stated commitment to change. Then Judge Holloway asked if Camille wished to address the court. This was, in retrospect, the moment when everything was decided. Camille stood. She was visibly emotional, which no one in the room interpreted as weakness exactly. They interpreted it as pressure. Her attorney had coached her, clearly. She started by saying she loved her daughter. She said she recognized that mistakes had been made. Then she said that Ivy had a tendency to misrepresent things. The courtroom held its breath. She has always been. She exaggerates for attention. I love her, but she has always made things seem more dramatic than they are. I think what happened has been very hard for everyone, but I believe that some of what Ivy described has been she paused, searching for the word, colored by the way she processes things. Nolan felt his jaw tighten. He looked at Judge Holloway. The judge's face had not changed, but something behind it had. 19 years of family court had given her an extraordinarily refined ability to recognize when a parent was in the room, but not in the room. Present physically, but unable to see their child as a separate person with a separate experience. She had seen it many times. It still bothered her every single time. She thanked Camille and asked her to sit down. She reviewed her notes for a long moment. Then she spoke. Full custody of Ivy to Nolan Grady. Supervised visitation for Camille, scheduled through the County Family Services Office. No unsupervised contact until further review. No order to vacate. Nolan retained the house. Financial settlement minimal, reflecting the circumstances of the dissolution. No child support obligation against Nolan. The business stayed with the man who built it. Camille bent forward over her table when the ruling was read. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder. Nolan looked at the front wall of the courtroom, just above the judge's bench. He did not look at Camille. He did not feel what he expected to feel, which would have been satisfaction, or relief, or some form of release. He felt very tired and very steady, the way a person feels when something long and difficult is finally behind them. He thanked Karen Yost. He picked up Ivy's backpack. He walked out of the courtroom and called his mother to say he was coming to pick up his daughter. 3 weeks after the custody ruling, Nolan stopped at the gas station on Route 9 on a Wednesday afternoon. He was driving back from a job consultation, a new commercial account he had been working to close for 2 months, a warehouse complex outside town that needed a full roof replacement. The meeting had gone well. He was thinking about materials costs and crew scheduling and the quiet satisfaction of a business that was growing despite everything that had been happening around it. He pulled up to the far pump and got out. Trevor's truck was at the pump across from him. Trevor had his back to Nolan when Nolan pulled in. He turned when he heard the engine, and the recognition hit his face immediately. The flinch of it, the quick recalibration in his eyes as he ran through his options in real time. He had lost weight too. His face was drawn. The bandages were long gone, but there was a slight irregularity across the bridge of his nose that would be there permanently. He was wearing a plain dark jacket, and he looked like a man who had been downgraded in every direction. Status, confidence, physical ease. He still had the truck at least. The gym was still open, though word was that membership had dropped significantly since the fall. He turned back toward his pump. He was going to pretend he had not seen Nolan. Then, apparently, he thought better of it. "This all going how you planned?" he called across the pumps. His voice had the brittle, artificial toughness of someone working very hard to project something they no longer felt. Big revenge fantasy, big courtroom victory. Feel good. Nolan finished screwing on his gas cap. He walked across the pump island. Trevor straightened up, but his back was already against his own truck and his options had narrowed considerably. "You touched my daughter," Nolan said. The flatness of his voice was somehow worse than anger. It was the voice of a man stating a fact that was going to have consequences regardless of argument. Trevor's jaw tightened. "Look, that whole situation, you touched my daughter," Nolan said again. Not louder, just again. Then he grabbed Trevor by the front of his jacket and slammed him against the truck with enough force to put a visible dent in the door panel. What followed lasted about 90 seconds. It was not wild. There was nothing in it that looked like a man who had lost control. It looked like a man who had decided, clearly and without improvisation, that this moment was owed. He was methodical about it in a way that was, if anything, more frightening than blind fury would have been. Each movement had purpose. Each impact was deliberate. 3 people watched from inside their cars and did not move. Someone recorded it on a phone from inside the convenience store. When Nolan stepped back, Trevor was on the pavement between his truck and the pump island, his breathing in rough, short bursts, his hands covering his face. Nolan crouched down. He waited until Trevor's eyes came up, and they were looking at each other directly. "You were safest," Nolan said quietly, "the day the police arrested you." Then he stood up. He got in his truck. He drove to his mother's house to pick up his daughter. He never saw Trevor Baines again. Summer arrived in Ash Creek the way it always did. Not gradually, but all at once. The trees at full green overnight, the humidity coming up from the river bottom and settling in like a tenant who had no intention of leaving. Nolan's yard, which had been bare dirt along the back fence all through winter, came up in something approximating grass. The tomato plants Ivy had helped him put in along the south fence in early May were already reaching for the stakes he had driven in beside them. She checked on them every morning before school, very seriously, as though the plants might have accomplished something interesting overnight. Ivy had started laughing again. Not the polite, careful laugh she had produced in the months right after the hospital. The real one, the loud and slightly undignified one that he had been afraid he would not hear again. It was the kind of laugh that came from her belly and left her leaning sideways, and it showed up at things that were genuinely funny to a 7-year-old, which was a wide and democratic category. She laughed at things he said that he had not intended to be funny. She laughed retelling something her friend at school had done, the story getting less coherent as the laughter overtook it, until he could not understand what had happened but found himself laughing anyway, just at the sight of her. She had been quiet for a long time. He had not realized how quiet until the quiet ended. On a Saturday in late June, Nolan put Ivy on the bicycle she had outgrown and then replaced with the blue one she had been asking for since February, and they drove down to the lake road on the western edge of town where the pavement was smooth and the traffic was light on weekend mornings. He parked near the boat launch, and they walked the bikes to the path. He had been teaching her for 3 weeks. She had taken to it the way she took to most physical things, not naturally at first, but with stubborn determination, which was worth more than natural ability in the long run. She had fallen 4 times, gotten up 4 times, and brushed off her palms each time with the same no-nonsense efficiency that she had inherited, he thought, directly from him. On the 5th attempt, she stayed upright for 40 yards before turning to look at him and then immediately overcorrecting and going sideways into the grass beside the path. She had gotten up from that one laughing. That was the moment he knew she was going to be fine. On the Saturday in June, she did not fall. She started slow, the way she always did, with that slight wobble of finding her balance. And then she found it, and she straightened up, and she started pedaling with purpose, and she went ahead without looking back. The blue bike catching light, her feet moving in that easy, found rhythm that meant she had gotten it, that the thing had clicked over from effort into instinct. Nolan jogged after her for 30 yards and then slowed to a walk because she did not need him running alongside her anymore. She looked back over her shoulder once, grinning, and yelled something he could not fully hear, and then faced forward again and kept going, and he stood in the middle of the lake road and watched her move away from him with the kind of feeling that is difficult to describe precisely. Not just pride, not just relief, but something that included both of those things and also included something more specific. The recognition that she was going to be okay. Not just now, not just today, in the real way. In a way that did not require constant monitoring or careful management or quiet prayers in the dark before sleep. Just okay. Actually going to be okay. He thought about the year behind them, not with bitterness, not even with the careful satisfaction he had expected to feel when it was over, just with the honest knowledge of what it had cost and what it had produced and what still remained. Camille lived in the small apartment on the south end of town. She had supervised visits with Ivy every other weekend through the County Family Services office, and she took them, and she was on time. And according to the coordinator, she was doing the work of someone who understood what she had earned back. Whether those visits would ever grow into something larger, whether the supervised sessions in the county building would become something that looked more like a real relationship, was not a question Nolan was spending time on. That was Camille's work to do, not his. He had his lane, and he intended to stay in it. Ivy never talked about those visits much when she came home. She was not wounded by them, and she was not excited by them. She treated them with the matter-of-fact neutrality of a child who has processed a complicated reality and arrived at a practical arrangement with it. He watched her carefully after each one. She always came home and went straight to the tomato plants. Trevor was serving time, having violated his probation twice in 3 months in a demonstration of the kind of self-destruction that becomes almost inevitable once a man stops having anything to protect. He would be inside for the better part of another year, at minimum. His gym had closed in February, a foreclosure notice on the door that 3 different people had texted Nolan about and that he had not responded to. Nobody in Ash Creek defended Camille anymore. The community had a long memory and a clear record, and eventually it had simply moved on to the truth. People were not cruel about it. Mostly, Ash Creek was not that kind of town. They were simply accurate. They knew what had happened, and they knew whose side they were on, and they did not pretend otherwise. The people at Ivy's school knew. The parents who had watched quietly for months had made their positions known in the quiet ways that community positions get made. The families on the street, the diner on Oak Street, and Ivy was beginning to know in the way that children grow into knowing things. Not all at once, not as a conversation or a revelation, but through the accumulation of small understandings. A question asked one morning over breakfast, an answer given honestly, a silence afterward that was not uncomfortable. She would know more as she grew older. She would carry pieces of that year with her the way everyone carries the hard years, not healed out of them, not separate from them, but built partly from them. What was built from them was something strong. Nolan understood that. He had his own hard years. He carried them, and they had not made him smaller. He watched his daughter come back around on the lake road in a wide, easy arc, her hair behind her, fully in control of the bike now, coming toward him faster than she had gone away. She was hollering something at him that resolved into words as she got closer. "Daddy, look at me. Look at me." He was looking. He was always looking. She pulled up in front of him and put one foot down in the gravel and stood there with enormous self-satisfaction, breathing hard, waiting for his reaction, smiling so wide that her eyes had almost disappeared. He put his hand on the top of her head. "I see you," he said. The sun was fully up over the lake by then, bright and flat on the water. A pair of swallows cut low across the surface and were gone. The road behind them ran back toward town and everything that had happened there. Ahead of them, the path curved gently around the water and went further than he could see from here. Ivy looked up at him. "Can we keep going?" she asked. Nolan started walking. "Yeah," he said. "Let's keep going." They rode until noon.